My name is Josh Mead, definitely a professional musician as by day and by night in terms of a job. I teach 30 private students around Connecticut, but also the more important question that I was going to answer is that I'm also a father of a lively 3-year-old. Super energetic, typical boy, running and jumping off things, landing on his head, the usual stuff, playing with toys, just doing the usual knucklehead stuff. It was a planned pregnancy. So we were planning, and we actually, funny enough, had people staying with us, so it definitely took a little bit longer than we wanted it to in terms of the conception process, but it is what it is. You don't necessarily have control over it. But she told me, and I was just over the moon that we were going to have our first child. Growing up with my family and growing up with me, unfortunately, my dad and my mother got divorced at a very young age for myself. Grew up with a single mom, 3 boys. So my parents got divorced when I was 4. My middle brother was 2, and my youngest brother was 9 months old. So my mother raised her 3 boys all the way up by herself. My dad was there, through at least when we were younger a little bit. He lived in the state, but then when I was 13, he moved down to New Orleans, and we would just see him over the summers, kind of a deal. But it was definitely a tougher childhood, growing up with a single mom, single family income, and trying to keep the 3 boys in a good school system, which she successfully achieved her goal. From a very, very early age, it affected my relationship with my son by making me want to be there for him at any single moment possible. Just a very, very motivating. I try to look at things in a positive way. And really just think about life and think about my son and think about my wife and just try to be there for them as much as possible, because when my father wasn't there with me and my younger brothers as well, it definitely left a void growing up. I mean, obviously when you're older, you kind of realize things and, understand that 2 people don't necessarily belong together if they're not happy. As an adult, you understand that. But as a kid, definitely didn't feel like that growing up. Some of the challenges that I find with being a dad are trying to understand what your child wants. My son is very young right now, and we're definitely going through some speech issues with him and just trying to get him on his way. But he's in an amazing preschool program, and that is definitely helping. But besides that, just trying to do what's right in your own mind for your child. Whether it's your boy or girl, doesn't matter. Just trying to make the right decision. And many times in life, we won't necessarily make the right decision, but I don't necessarily have all the answers, and I think that's the toughest part about being a mom or a dad, is that you're never going to have all the answers for your kid. You want to be their knight in shining armor as much as possible, but from a health standpoint, at this point it's a water or a drop in the bucket rather. He's a happy, healthy kid. Well, to be cool and cool dad, I think is a little different, but I don't necessarily even view myself as a cool person. I think it's just more of a subjective question, but the more important question of being a cool dad is just being there for your son or your daughter, depending on what you have, and your wife more importantly too. I think as we get older and we get more into the life of our child and the life of ourselves, we tend to lose sight of where our relationship happened and why our relationship happened in the first place. So making that a priority as well is super important, because you're not going to have that time that you want with your spouse depending on your career. I mean, if you can make it work, great, but 9 times out of 10 you're going to be working opposite shifts, running here, running there, and this is when our child is young. So it's only, as a public school teacher for 8 years, it's only going to get more busy the more you grow up and the more your son gets older as well. Some of the sacrifices that I had to make as a dad is obviously social life. Not that I had one before, but and just being there for my son. Obviously your son is your number 1 priority, and you have to be home when your wife, or in our situation, we work opposite hours at this point in our lives. Before I was a school teacher and worked, the typical 7:30 in the morning commute to, sometimes they get home at 5 or 6 at night. So they'd actually, funny enough, already be getting ready for bed, because sometimes my wife had to work night shift or go in early in the morning. So we've been on opposite shifts for a long time. and just physically having to be there for your son, because you can't afford a babysitter every single time you have to leave. So right after, not necessarily right after college, but once my wife and I got settled, and we were settled at least a little bit more than a poor college student. We both had our first jobs right out of school. I really wanted to get that first car, that first nice car that you wanted. So I was able to purchase 2015 Subaru WRX and modify it to my liking, over the course of a year or two, and then just have that, that first dream car that I've been wanting since I was, 16. It's a typical, 16-year-old boy racer car, but I was lucky enough to be able to do it by the time I was 28, buying that car and modifying it. So while having the Subaru WRX, it was an awesome car, because I modified it the way that I wanted it to be, over a year or so. But I also drive a lot as a professional musician. In 3 years, I drove almost 80,000 miles on the car, a lot of highway driving. But then more importantly, a couple of years down the road, we decided to have our first kid. And it wasn't necessarily the right choice to, bopping around a newborn in, with the race-inspired tight suspension is not necessarily the best for a newborn's head or neck that are not necessarily formed. So obviously the right choice was to make what I like to call the family shift and buy a safer car. So I went from a 450 horsepower WRX to a 2018 Tiguan, which is definitely a huge switch for me, but obviously the more important switch is to have a safe vehicle for my son and for him to just grow up in a happy, healthy life. But I don't necessarily see it as a sacrifice. You're being there for your child. Some of the traditions that I like to do, I'm a musician professionally, so definitely at least try to introduce music to my son. Not necessarily force him to play or anything like that, but if he wants to, do the piano, brass instrument, wood instrument, I really don't care if he wants, but as long as he at least is exposed to it at a young age and throughout, middle school and the high school years, I think it's a great thing to have. Because when you're listening to music, whether you're either listening to music or playing music, you'll never be alone a day in your life. And it's definitely gotten me through some tough times in my life, as well as, pretty much anybody they talk to. They don't have to be a professional musician to understand that. But for me, it definitely goes above and beyond for the next level, because not only is it my passion, it's my job.